So in case you missed my last video, I went over the basics of building cabinets, or at least my method for building cabinets, and got a lot of great response on that video, so I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. And I got a lot of comments asking me to basically continue on that series, tackling drawers and doors and the rest of the cabinet building process. And so in this video, I want to tell you guys everything I know about building drawers, the different type of drawer slides, different construction methods for your drawer boxes, and how to install them in your cabinets. And I know at least when I was getting started, drawers were pretty confusing. There is a lot of terminology that as a newbie you have never heard before, and it can be pretty overwhelming even just going to the drawer hardware aisle of your local home center and trying to figure out which kind of drawers you want to build. So let's jump right in at the beginning and talk about the different types of drawer slides, because I think this will really dictate a lot of how you're going to build the drawers and your drawer sizes and all of that kind of stuff. And so in the world of drawer slides, there's really two main categories. You've got undermount slides and side mount slides. And there is a third category, center mount slides. Those are a little bit old school. I've personally never used them on a project, and I think the world has kind of moved on from center mount slides. So these are the two types that I would personally consider for a project. And so there are a few main differences between undermount slides and side mount slides. Typically, side mount slides are going to be cheaper, and if you're building a project with a lot of drawers, this price difference can really add up. But undermount slides do have some really nice features that set them apart from side mount slides. I think number one being that they're incredibly adjustable. These types of slides utilize a clip that's installed on the bottom of your drawer box, and this clip allows you to adjust the front of the drawer up, down, side to side, and even in and out. So even if you're not very precise with installing your drawers, you can still usually get the fit dialed in without having to make any actual adjustments to the drawer box itself. But again, all of that convenience comes at a price, and as I'll talk about later in the video, these types of slides are at least 25% more expensive, if not double the cost of side mount slides. The next thing to consider when picking out your drawer slides is the drawer extension. And this is going to dictate how far out your drawer extends from your cabinet. And typically you've got kind of three main categories. First, you've got 3/4 extension, which you're typically going to see on cheaper drawer slides like those epoxy side mount slides that are the ultimate budget-friendly drawer slide option. But this is going to limit that drawer travel, so it's going to be a little tougher to get at whatever you're storing in the back quarter of the drawer. Next up is going to be full extension, and this is pretty much the minimum I go with on my projects. Almost all of these undermount slides are going to be full extension, and it just makes it a lot easier to access what you're storing in your drawer, which is kind of the whole point of building drawers in the first place. And last is going to be over travel or over extension, and I love these kind of slides because it makes it even easier to get at what's in your drawer. And this can be especially useful for more specialty situations where you might be storing a larger item in a drawer, and it's going to be a lot easier to get that item in and out of the drawer if the drawer is fully clear of the cabinet. And so overextension slides are a great thing to consider for that, and that's actually the type of slide that's on my existing miter saw station, and they've been very, very handy over the years. And then the last thing to consider when picking out drawer slides is going to be the weight rating. And typically this isn't something I pay a lot of attention to. Most of the slides you're going to use are going to have plenty of weight capacity between 75 and 100 pounds. So way more than you're typically going to need to store in a drawer. And I know I've got little kids and I've built furniture with undermount slides that they pull out the drawers and lean their entire body weight on, and they have never done any damage to drawer slides that I've installed. So I think these things are pretty much bulletproof. Again, unless you're looking to store something really, really heavy, and then you can look at some of those specialty, more beefy drawer slides. Some of those will even lock in the in and out position, and those type of slides are great for storage in work or camper vans and also in truck beds.
I think that's strong enough. Wow, that's crazy.
So next, let's talk about price. And as I mentioned, there is a pretty vast difference in the price point between your cheapest slides and your most expensive. The cheapest are generally going to be the side mount epoxy slides, as they're called. And I don't even have any here in the shop because I personally don't really love them. But if you're on a budget, they are a great option because for a 22-inch slide, you're looking at about $11, which is really, really inexpensive. Some of the limitations of those types of slides are going to be that they lack any sort of soft close functionality, and they're usually not going to be full extension, so you're going to lose some access to the stuff stored in the back of that drawer. Next up on the list are your classic full extension side mount ball bearing slides. These are kind of the Goldilocks between the super cheap epoxy slides and the more expensive undermount slides. And I think that's why these are so popular. I know I've used them a ton on projects. You see them on all kinds of different types of storage you might buy. I know pretty much every rolling tool chest uses these types of slides because they're beefy, it's easy to install and remove the drawers, and a lot of them are going to be full extension and can have some other bells and whistles like soft close or self close or push to open. And for a 22-inch version of these slides, you're looking at about 25 bucks. Last, the Gucci of all slides is going to be the undermount slide, and these are by far my personal favorite. I think the finished drawers look and feel so nice. If you've ever used undermount slides, you'll know what I'm talking about. It is a pleasure to open and close drawers made with undermount slides, but you're going to pay a premium for these slides. For the Rockler brand version, which I have here, you're looking at about 35 bucks for a pair of 21-inch slides. For the Bloom version, you're looking at about $43 for a pair of 21-inch slides. And believe it or not, depending on the functionality, they can keep going up from there. There are some very fancy options from some of these European manufacturers like Bloom, Hafele, Salice, and if you want to get really fancy with your projects, definitely check out some of the hardware they have because it can really elevate the finished feel of your project. And while it is expensive, if you're only building a piece of furniture with a couple of drawer slides, it might be worth investing in some of that cooler hardware. But just to illustrate the difference these slide prices can make on the total cost of a project, if I were to build this miter saw station I'm working on right now, which has 12 drawer slides with the epoxy side mount slides at 11 bucks a pop, I'd be looking at $132 versus if I use the Bloom undermount slides, the 21-inch versions, I'd be looking at 516 bucks. So that is obviously a massive difference and probably enough to cover almost all of the other materials for the project. So I think especially for shop projects, you probably want to consider getting some more budget-friendly options, but on finer furniture pieces, I definitely personally think it's well worth splurging, especially in places like kitchens or bathrooms where you're going to be using those drawer slides day in and day out. So that about covers your hardware options. So let's move over to my assembly table and we can talk about drawer slide length and how to size your drawer boxes. All right, so next, now that we've covered the drawer slides themselves, let's talk about the drawer boxes. And I know this was something that was really confusing to me when I was just getting started because how do you come up with the drawer box size based on just the drawer slides and your cabinet size? And I know when I was getting started, the first thing I tried to do was maximize my drawer box sizes. And that is a mistake because it just makes the whole installation process a lot more difficult. You have to be a lot more precise. And if you have any issues, it's a lot harder to modify the drawer box itself than it is to just move the drawer slide. And so if you think about it, most drawers are not going to be filled to the brim with stuff. Go look through all the drawers in your house and your shop. Most of those drawers are not even going to be halfway full. So instead of trying to absolutely maximize the height of all the drawer boxes, give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. At a bare minimum, I would say at least an inch between each drawer box and an inch between the top and at least about a half an inch from the bottom. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So when it comes to the size and configuration of your drawer boxes, obviously the world is your oyster. You're building custom cabinets. They can be whatever you want. But if you take a look at most commercially available cabinetry, you'll probably notice a trend. On a typical bank of drawers like this, you're either going to have evenly spaced drawers, so multiple drawers all the exact same size, or you're going to have some mixture like this with two smaller drawers up top and one bigger drawer in the bottom. As you might have noticed, I really like this kind of configuration for a shop because this larger drawer in the bottom is great for storing things like power tools or big bottles of glue, any bulky items, and then you can store things like hardware or smaller items in the top drawers. And so doing the math was super simple. I took the total inside height, divided it in two, subtracted 1.5 inches or 2 inches from that bottom measurement to get the height of my bottom drawer, subtracted 2.5 or 3 inches from that top half dimension, and then divided that in two, and then you've got your drawer box dimensions. And so in this case, we have 11.5 inches for that bottom drawer and 5.5 inches for the two top drawers. And as you'll notice, I left a pretty huge gap here on this bottom drawer. And that was mostly because I didn't want to waste plywood making this drawer taller, because even if I was storing something very tall in here, this 12-inch, almost 12-inch deep drawer is going to be plenty high enough to keep those items in place without them somehow falling out. And typically when I'm thinking about drawer box height, I'm thinking in multiples of 12 or 6, because that kind of number will go into a 48-inch wide piece of plywood very nicely. So the next thing to consider when sizing your drawer boxes is going to be the length of the sides, and to figure that out, you need to figure out your slide length. So in the case of this cabinet, this is a 24-inch deep base cabinet. I subtracted about an inch from that dimension to account for the stretcher and a back panel, which in this case I don't have. That left me with 23 inches, and so then I can figure out what slide to get based on either side mount or under mount. Side mount slides usually come in increments of 2, so in this case I would use a 22-inch drawer slide. And undermount slides come in increments of 3, so in this case I'd use a 21-inch drawer slide. And every drawer needs some clearance behind the back of the drawer just to allow the drawer to slide in and out and lock into the hardware. But this is especially true with undermount slides because these types of slides have a retention hook on the back that has to hook into the back of the drawer box. And so you need some clearance behind the drawers for that. And that's why undermount slides are sized in this way. 21-inch slides go with 24-inch base cabinets, end of story. So as far as sizing the actual sides of your drawer boxes, usually the length of your drawer box sides is gonna match the length of your drawer slides. In the case of undermount slides, this is absolutely a critical dimension because, as I mentioned, that retention hook has to interface with the back of the box. So if your box is too long, it's not gonna work. So again, I'm using 21-inch slides, so the sides of these drawer boxes are 21 inches long. With side mount slides, you have a little bit more wiggle room, but honestly, I would just match the size to the drawer slide length, just like with undermount slides, because otherwise you can start running into interference problems with your drawers running into the back of the cabinet, and there's nothing more annoying than accidentally building a drawer box too big and having to trim it down after screwing and gluing and doing whatever to it. It's a total pain. So just leave yourself some extra wiggle room and it will save you some hassle later on. So the next dimension to consider is going to be the drawer box width, and this is really going to depend on the slides you're using. Side mount slides typically need a ½ inch of clearance on either side of the drawer box. So let's say your cabinet opening is 21 inches. You would subtract an inch from that because ½ an inch on either side. So that's 20 inches for the total width of your drawer box. And so then your drawer front and back, you would subtract another inch if you're using ½ inch material. So then you would have a 19-inch long drawer front and drawer back. Undermount slides are a little different because the measurement you're working with is to the inside face of your drawer box sides. And that number is 13/16, which is kind of an annoyingly specific number. That is until you realize when you double that number, it's a nice 1 5/8 of an inch. So again, let's say your cabinet is 21 inches wide on the inside. You would subtract an 1 5/8 from that, which is gonna give you 19 3/8, and that'll be the width of the front and back panels of your drawer. Super simple. So then once you've worked out all of the dimensions of your drawer boxes, you can start building. And for me, that starts with 3D modeling. As you guys know, I'm a total 3D modeling nerd. I like to have everything modeled up before I step foot in the shop. So I jump into SketchUp, model up all my drawer boxes. And this is also where I can make decisions about the joinery methods, what material the drawer boxes will be built out of. And that way, when I go into the shop, I don't even have to think about any of that stuff. I've got a cut list and a cutting diagram, and I can get to work. So as far as materials, you really have two main choices, either plywood or sheet goods or solid wood. And I know personally, 99% of the time I go with plywood. I think it's pretty much the perfect material for drawer boxes, but I definitely understand that a lot of people like that nicer, fancier look of solid wood, especially if you're gonna do things like dovetails or other nicer joinery. It can definitely elevate a piece of furniture. As far as material thicknesses, I typically use ½ inch material for my sides and either 1/4 inch or ½ inch material for my bottoms. And I know when I was first starting out building cabinetry, this was definitely something I went way overboard with. I know on the miter saw station I built originally, I used 3/4 inch material for the sides and 3/4 inch material for the bottoms, which is just insane overkill. It is absolutely unnecessary, a complete waste of materials and money. I don't think you need that at all in almost any situation. If you're using solid wood, you might want to beef up the sides to 5/8 of an inch just because I think it'll be a little bit easier to work with, but otherwise you do not need anything thicker. And I went with 1/4 inch bottoms on these shallower drawers and then ½ inch bottoms on the deeper drawers, just because I'll probably be storing some heavier stuff in those drawers. When it comes to drawer box joinery, you have a ton of different options. You can keep it really simple with things like pin nails and glue. You could just screw through the sides of the drawers if you don't really care about how that looks. I use pocket screws a lot of times because, especially for undermount slides, these pocket holes will be hidden in the finished piece and they make for a drawer box that's pretty quick to assemble. And it also doesn't really matter if I'm using pre-finished or unfinished plywood because those pocket screws will hold either way. You can definitely go nuts with biscuits or dominoes or rabbits or dovetails or whatever. Really, that choice is up to you and how much time you want to spend building your drawer boxes. I know for me, I do not want to spend any more time than I absolutely have to, so I never choose things like dovetails. Yes, they look great, they're super strong, but I just think they're a total pain. So I don't do it. If you do it, that's great. But at the end of the day, I'm a plywood guy, and I think dovetails on plywood is just a little bit weird. You also need to consider your bottom panel and how that's going to be attached to the drawer box. You can keep it super simple and just cut the bottom panel to the same size as the exterior drawer box and glue and nail it on the bottom. And that definitely works great, especially if you're using side mount slides, because that plywood edge won't really be seen in the finished product. You can also add a little chamfer to that bottom plywood edge, and that makes that plywood edge essentially disappear in the finished project. If you're going to be using undermount slides, you have to inset the drawer bottom, usually a ½ an inch from the bottom edge of the drawer box, and this leaves clearance for the undermount slides. And so when I'm building these drawers, the drawer bottom is housed in a groove. So I make those grooves 1/4 inch deep, and the dimension of the drawer bottom, I just subtract a ½ an inch from the width and 1/4 inch from the depth, since I do not have a groove on the back edge here. So then once I have all that figured out, I can generate my cut list and cutting diagram, and then head over to the table saw to start breaking down my pieces. And this process is very similar to the process I showed in my cabinet building video. The main thing I'm keeping in mind is that I want to cut off that factory edge, because usually it's kind of mangled, doesn't look nice, and if you're going to be adding any sort of edge banding to the edges of your drawer boxes, you want a nice clean square edge for that edge banding to be applied to. So now that these pieces are cut down to size, I need to cut a 1/4 inch groove, a ½ an inch up from the bottom edge of the drawer sides and the drawer box fronts. And so the groove will be a 1/4 inch wide for the drawers with 1/4 inch bottoms, and a ½ an inch wide for the drawers with ½ inch bottoms. Now you can cut this groove with a bunch of different blades. You could really just use a standard blade. It doesn't really matter if it's absolutely perfect. If the groove has a few little ridges on the bottom of it, you're never gonna see it. So if you don't feel like changing your blade, you certainly don't have to. You could just cut an 1/8 of an inch groove, move the fence over an 1/8 of an inch, and then cut another 1/8 of an inch groove. But the blade I like to use, oh yeah, I forgot I have this blade storage thing on the wall now. The blade I like to use is this 1/4 inch, I guess it's a box joint blade. I saw this on my buddy Mike Farrington's channel, and it's basically just a 1/4 inch wide blade, so you don't have to deal with getting out a dado stack. It is pretty much perfect for this kind of drawer bottom groove cutting. Now obviously 1/4 inch plywood isn't actually 1/4 of an inch thick, so the groove will have a little bit of play, but I don't think that really makes any difference in the finished drawer. And then for those ½ inch bottoms, I'll just make one cut, move the fence over, and make the second cut, and I'll be good to go. As far as the cutting depth, I want to be just a hair over 1/4 of an inch, which is basically halfway through the drawer sides. Making it just a hair over will just give me a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to assembling the drawers. And then once again, we want our fence ½ an inch from the inside edge of the blade. And that just gives clearance for the undermount drawer slides. And there we go. When I'm running these pieces, I want to be mindful of any slight bow in these pieces of plywood, because if the groove depth isn't consistent, it can cause issues in the assembly process later. And to help with that, I like to use these same grout floats that I use when I'm working with the jointer, and they help me keep even, consistent downward pressure on this piece. Now you could use some sort of feather boards. I don't really have a setup with this fence to be able to use feather boards, and I can keep even enough pressure just with these grout floats. So now that all the grooves are cut, we can move on to joinery. And most of the time when I'm building drawers to go with undermount drawer slides, I go with pocket holes. To drill the pocket holes, I have a pocket hole jig set up, and I have this set up with the Craig Micro, I guess, pocket hole jig system. And so this system drills smaller pocket holes that are perfect when you're working with thinner material, like this ½ inch material that the drawer boxes are made out of. So the process is super simple. I just clamp my piece in the jig. I'm gonna drill 3 holes on each end, and then I also have a dust collection hose set up here just to help clear out the dust out of those pocket holes. And in just a matter of seconds, I have 6 pocket holes drilled on this drawer back, and I just need to repeat the process on all of the drawer box fronts and backs for all of the drawers. Obviously, you do not want to drill pocket holes in the sides of the drawers, because otherwise you're gonna see that in the finished project, and you don't need them there in the first place. But I've definitely made that error, which is why you see I have all the sides of the drawers in separate piles kind of further away, so I cannot be tempted just to start grabbing parts as I'm getting in the groove here, drilling a bunch of these pocket holes. So one other thing I like to do before I assemble the drawer boxes is to go ahead and add a bullnose profile to all of the edges of these drawer box parts. And this just gives those edges a nice rounded finished feel. I'm not gonna be adding edge banding to these drawer boxes. I don't add edge banding to any of my drawer boxes. I like the exposed plywood look personally, and this bullnose profile just gives the drawer box a little bit more of a finished look. Now these can be a little bit tricky to get perfectly set up, so I did create a setup block when I started doing this in my drawer boxes a few years ago, and that definitely helps to tune it in, but it's also still a good idea to make some test cuts on some scrap pieces of the same material to make sure everything is dialed in properly. Now to make this super simple for myself, I have a power feeder here on my router table, and it is perfect for jobs like this because I know the power feeder will keep nice, even, consistent downward pressure and pressure against the fence so that I'll end up with a perfectly consistent bullnose across the entire piece. Now, if you don't have a bullnose bit, you can do the same kind of thing with a roundover. The nice thing about the bullnose is it just does it in one pass rather than two passes on each edge. And one other thing I should mention with the way I'm building these drawer boxes is you should not add this bullnose profile to the bottom edge of the back of the drawer box, because that edge is what the drawer bottom will screw into. And if that edge had a rounded profile, it would just make things a little funky. So with the bullnose added, I am ready to assemble these drawer boxes, which is pretty simple. As you can see, here's an example of one of the finished boxes. The big difference here is that typically I do full height backs on these drawer boxes and then notch out for the undermount slides, but I figured I would try this technique. I do think it's a little bit more efficient, but it's just one more thing to kind of juggle measurement and part wise in a project which is pretty large already. So you can kind of go either way there. Notching the back panel is super simple, but let's go ahead and see how we put one of these drawer boxes together. So I'm gonna grab a front, a back, and then two sides. And remember, on this back piece, I left the bottom without the bullnose profile because that's where the drawer bottom will be attached. Obviously on these sides and the front, the groove for the drawer bottom need to be facing in. And then the one tricky thing with this bullnose is I add it to the bottom and the top edges just so all of the edges of the drawer box are broken, but it makes it a little bit harder when it comes time to assemble this because I need to somehow stand these up and get them clamped, and having that rounded bottom makes them a little bit more tippy. And so because I'm using pocket screws to assemble these drawer boxes, it is absolutely critical that you clamp the parts together before driving in those pocket screws, because they have the tendency to make these pieces pull out of alignment because they're being driven in at an angle. So once I have these corners nice and flush, I'll really crank down the clamps and then we can drive in the screws. And so the screws you want to use are these 1-inch pocket hole screws. These are the plywood variety. They do come in a fine thread. For hardwoods, you want the coarse thread since this is plywood. The only problem is evidently my drill bit for drilling the pocket holes had slipped at some point, and so all of these pocket holes are about 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch too deep. So instead, I'm gonna have to switch to some 3/4 inch screws, but typically if you're using 1/2 inch material, 1-inch pocket screws are the way to go. Now to drive the pocket screws, you can either use an impact driver or a drill. I tend to like to use a drill when I'm working with this thin of material, especially plywood, because it's very easy to kind of strip out those screws. So a good drill. Turn the clutch setting down. I have this set to about 9. Not that that really matters unless you have this exact drill, and then we can drive in these screws. And I actually find it easier to go ahead and stick the screws in the pocket holes rather than trying to guide them in there on the end of the drill bit. All right, so there's the front done. Now we can flip this over and install the back, which again needs to be flush with the top edge of the drawer box. All right, so there are the drawer sides, and now we need to get the drawer bottom in. Look to see which side looks better. Definitely this side. And that slid in perfectly. And now you can see this back edge of the drawer bottom is flush with the drawer back. Back panel is actually a little bit bowed, so I can go ahead and pull that out slightly while I'm pre-drilling for the screws to attach to this drawer bottom. And I'm just using 1.25-inch screws here. And there we go. There is an assembled drawer box. Let's check it for square. 30 1/4, 30 1/4. So
perfectly square, goes together really, really quickly. And so I should mention that I typically don't finish a lot of my drawer boxes, especially if it's gonna be like a dresser or some sort of lower use kind of item. I am probably gonna add some finish to these drawers just because it's gonna be in a shop environment. Also, I'm a little bit nervous with the huge mold outbreak I had here at my shop, and so I am kind of leaning towards applying finish to all of my shop projects now. But you could make this process a little easier on yourself by pre-finishing these drawer box parts before you assemble them, because as you know, if you've tried to finish the inside of a box like this, it can be pretty tricky even if you're spraying finish. So that's one down, and I think I have 10 more to go. So let's go ahead and get to work. So once your drawer boxes are assembled, it's time to get them installed in the cabinets. And that can be pretty daunting if you've never done it before, but honestly, it is very simple, especially with the right tools. So as you can see, I have a bunch of different jigs for installing drawers, and these definitely help, but they're also not necessary, especially if you're using side mount slides. Side mount slides are really simple to install. I usually start at the bottom of the cabinet and work my way up. I install the slide itself on the inside of the cabinet. Usually for an overlay drawer, the slides are gonna have to be inset by a little bit. The instructions that come with your slides will tell you what that dimension is, but you basically just get the slide screwed to the inside of the cabinet. And then what I do is typically take a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch scrap piece of plywood, put it inside on the bottom of the cabinet, and then set my drawer box in position on top of that spacer. From there, I can just slide out the drawer little by little, adding screws and attaching the drawer slides to the drawer box until I basically run out of room, and then I can remove the drawer to add the last screw or two, and then I'm good to go with that first drawer. From there, I'll use the same spacer system to install the rest of the drawer boxes, depending on whatever spacing I came up with when I was modeling the project. And so as you can see, this process goes really quickly. It is basically foolproof. You cannot install your drawer slides in the wrong spot, which is something you can do if you start from the top and work your way down, cutting down a spacer and installing all your slides first. It's very easy to inch monster yourself and have a lot of your drawers end up an inch off, which is a total pain. Now, when it comes to installing these undermount slides, I definitely use a jig. If the slides are going to be installed in a face frame cabinet, I'll use this jig from Rockler. It holds the slide in place with a magnet. It automatically insets the drawer slide as much as it needs to be, and then I can just pre-drill a couple holes and screw the slide in place. If I'm installing undermount slides on a frameless cabinet like this, I like to use this bloom jig. It makes this whole process super simple because it has all of the hole spacing already built into the jig, and I just cut some plywood spacers that correspond with my drawer spacing, and it's super simple. The last thing you need to do when installing these undermount drawers is to install the clips that come with these drawer slides on the bottom of the drawer boxes. And I have yet another jig for this. This jig is designed for the bloom slides and clips, and so it has some holes here for pre-drilling those holes. It also has holes here for drilling the holes on the back of these drawer boxes that accept those retention hooks I talked about earlier. So if you're gonna be working with undermount slides, I would highly recommend picking up a jig like this. And installing the clips themselves will differ a little bit manufacturer to manufacturer. Let me show you how these Rockler clips go on. So if I were installing bloom drawer slides here, I would use this jig to drill the holes on the front of the drawer box to mount those drawer clips. But these Rockler clips use a little bit of a different configuration. As you can see, they attach through these holes. The one trick is that these clips are sized for 5/8 of an inch drawer box material. So instead, all I have to do is space this clip off the front by 1/8 of an inch. I just have a little 1/8 inch spacer here, and then I can add my screws here. But to drill these holes, I use a self-centering drill bit. And in addition to those two holes, there's one more tiny little hole back here for a very small screw. And this is the screw. As you can see, it's absolutely minuscule. So definitely set your impact driver to a low setting or use a drill. And you can also see that this is where all of that adjustability is built in on these slides. This adjustment moves the drawer box in and out. This moves it left and right, and this moves it up and down. And then this is how you release the drawer clip from the drawer slides to easily remove the drawer. And now the most satisfying part, sliding the drawers in for the first time. So satisfying. So once that's done, your drawer boxes are installed, and all that's left is to install your false fronts, which again is very simple, I guess, depending on what style of front you use. I typically go with a slab front, which basically just means it's a piece of plywood, and so that makes it really, really easy. I make my drawer fronts 1/8 of an inch narrower than the total width of the cabinet, so that way I have a 1/16 of an inch of clearance on either side, and then I leave 1/8 of an inch gap between the heights of the drawer fronts. And installing the drawer fronts with the cabinet up on your bench is really simple. I use 1/8" spacers below the first drawer front, clamp it in place, pre-drill and screw it to the drawer box with some 1" screws from inside, and I just work my way up from there. Depending on the style of drawer pull you're using, you can also use this technique where you go ahead and pre-drill all of the handle mounting holes on your drawer fronts, and then use those holes to temporarily screw the drawer fronts to the drawer boxes. And then once they're attached, you can permanently attach them from the inside before removing those temporary screws and adding your drawer pulls. And then once all that's done, the only thing left to do is make any fine adjustments. And this is where those undermount slides really come in handy, because again, you can adjust the drawer boxes in and out, up and down, and side to side, which definitely makes your life a lot easier. That said, you do still have a little bit of adjustability built into side mount slides, and you can also make adjustments to the false front to tweak that positioning as well. All right, I think that's it.